Whenever any American's religious liberty is infringed, every American should be concerned. Religious liberty is a part of the American character. Before our Constitution was adopted, religious liberty was a part of the American character. It was the reason the first Europeans settled on our shores. It was a great source of the American Revolution. My Scotch-Irish Presbyterian ancestors came here to escape religious persecution from two churches, and when they came here, they objected to the fact that they had to pay taxes to support another church. So our very foundation as a country has in it the guarantees of religious freedom. That is why after the states created our Constitution, the people came back and said, wait a minute, you forgot something. You forgot the Bill of Rights. And the Bill of Rights begins with the guarantees of religious liberty. They're emblazoned on the wall at the museum at the corner of Pennsylvania and 6th Avenue, the guarantees of liberty. They're spoken by President Franklin Roosevelt when he talked about World War II and why we were fighting that great war. So whenever any American's religious liberty is trampled upon, every American should be concerned. That's why I'm so disappointed today that Senate Democrats are proposing to carve a giant hole out of America's religious freedom. This is very different than what has consistently been the attitude in this body. 21 years ago, the Congress voted to pass the Religious Freedom Restoration Act, an act which reflects the American character as well as any other act that Congress has passed. It created a very high hurdle for government to burden a person's religious belief. That legislation says that if the government is going to take an action that creates a burden on a person's faith, the government must prove that there's a compelling national interest and that that burden must be as light as possible. That bill passed nearly unanimously. It became law nearly unanimously, with support from many here in the Senate today, many on the other side of the aisle who are supporting this carve-out for religious freedom. When he signed the law into bill, President Bill Clinton was eloquent. The president said, we have all shared a desire to protect perhaps the most precious of all American liberties, religious freedom. That's President Clinton talking. Usually the signing of an act of legislation by a president is a ministerial act, he said, often a quiet ending to a turbulent legislative process. Today, this event assumes a more majestic quality because of our ability together, said President Clinton, to affirm the historic role that people of faith have played in the history of this country and the constitutional protections those who profess and express their faith have always demanded and cherished. But here we are today debating a Democrat proposal to gut the law that President Clinton was describing and require Americans who own businesses to provide insurance coverage for any health care item or service that is required by federal law or regulation, whether or not it violates the employer's sincere religious belief. So what has changed? On June 30, a few days ago, the Supreme Court of the United States found that the law meant what Congress and the President said it did when it was enacted. They held that the federal government could not order the owners of a closely held company to violate the basic tenets of their faith. The company in question in this case, Hobby Lobby, and having been a law student, I know that over time this will be known in law schools across the country as the great case of Hobby Lobby because of its importance and because of its name. The company in question is owned by the Green family, who've made their faith central to their business. They closed their stores on Sunday. They refuse to engage in profitable transactions that facilitate or promote alcohol use. They contribute profits to Christian missionaries and ministries. No one doubts those are sincerely held religious beliefs. The Green family's health insurance covers 16 of 20 forms of contraception. It does not cover 4 forms of contraception that prevent implantation of the embryo. Employers are free to purchase those 4 forms themselves. The company in no way interferes with its employees' lives. It does not tell them what to do with their bodies. It does not tell them how to live their lives. It simply does not offer in the company's insurance plan coverage of the 4 forms of contraception that violate the faith of the owners of the business. Now, Obamacare regulations tried to mandate 20 forms of contraception, but recognizing that this violated the faith of those who believe in life at conception, they created carve-out for several organizations, Catholic hospitals, for example. They could have created a similar carve-out for closely held companies, but they did not. So instead, the Green family and others were forced to defend their freedoms in court, which fortunately ruled that the family was entitled to protection from the government's mandates under the Religious Freedom Restoration Act. This ought to have been a victory for everyone, if it is true in our country that when any American's religious freedom is upheld, all of us benefit. But in 1993, the passage of the legislation was hailed as a momentous achievement of religious freedom. The New York Times editorialized in support of it. My friend Senator Reid from Nevada, now the majority leader, said he was proud to be a co-sponsor of that legislation. It's a fine bill. The distinguished senator from New York, Senator Schumer, then a member of the House, and the lead Democratic sponsor said this is a good moment for those of us who believe in the flower of religious freedom that so adorns America. But here we are today, debating a bill that would fundamentally undermine that very act spoken of so eloquently by the Democratic leaders in Congress and by the Democratic President of the United States. What has changed? If they are successful, an American who opens a business in this country will know that he or she will forfeit their right to religious freedom. That is not consistent with the American character. That is not the American way. Why would Democrats who felt so strongly about this in 1993 feel so differently today? Why would they be willing to do such damage to the cause of religious freedom they so ardently proclaimed? Because the Democrats, quote, believe they have a powerful campaign weapon, unquote, in this issue, according to a report in Politico. The Democrats charge that under the Supreme Court decision, an employer's personal views can interfere with women's access to essential health services. They say that under this decision, corporations can limit their employees' health care options and restrict their freedoms. Madam President, that is not true. It is patently false. It is absurd. It is wrong. In the words of the Washington Post's nonpartisan fact checker, Glenn Kessler, nothing in the ruling allows a company to stop a woman from getting or filling a prescription for contraceptives. Second, Democrats need to be more careful, he says, the fact checker says, in their language about the ruling. All too often, lawmakers leap to conclusions that are not warranted by the facts. Simply put, the court ruling does not outlaw contraceptives, does not allow bosses to prevent women from seeking birth control, and does not take away a person's religious freedom. I ask consent to include in the record the fact checker's full remarks.
Without objection.
Today, women have the same rights that they did before Obamacare. The Supreme Court decision did not, at least in terms of religious freedom, they do. The Supreme Court decision did nothing to change and alter a woman's ability to access birth control or other contraceptive care. Hobby Lobby's insurance today already covers 16 of 20 forms of contraception for the company's employees. A Hobby Lobby employee who wishes to use a drug or device not covered by the company's insurance is in no way prohibited from purchasing it. Nothing in the Hobby Lobby decision prevents a woman from making a decision about contraception, her own decision about contraception. The only effect of the decision is that certain employers cannot be forced to include in their insurance coverage against their religious objections. The Supreme Court decision covered certain closely held for-profit companies, meaning they're controlled by 5 or fewer individuals, where the owners have sincere religious beliefs. The court's decision does not mean that all Americans of faith who own businesses and ask for a religious exemption from a general law will receive that exemption. And the court's decision does not mean that employers will be able to use the Religious Freedom Restoration Act as a reason to refuse to cover critical health services such as vaccines, blood transfusions, HIV treatment. In fact, such fears were raised by opponents of the Religious Freedom Restoration Act before it became law in 1993. The Democrats didn't believe those objections then. They shouldn't believe them now, because 20 years later, those doomsday predictions have not come true. Courts are well equipped to dispel spurious or frivolous claims. I think the Democrats know all of this. I think they're just trying to win an election. The Supreme Court decision was about individual freedoms that do not disappear if you decide to open a business. It was not about contraceptive rights. What is really happening, Madam President, is my friends on the other side of the aisle are trying to change the subject. They want to talk about health care, but they don't want to talk about Obamacare and what it's doing to the women of this country. And let me tell you a story that gives you example. That's what really concerns me. First, what concerns me is the destruction of anyone's religious freedom. But if we're talking about women in health care, let me tell you about Emily of Lawrenceburg. She's 39 years old. She came to see me. She has lupus. She had, under Tennessee's policies, an insurance policy granted by something called R-Tenn. It was created by our Democratic governor and Blue Cross. It gave her the policy that she needed to provide health insurance for a 39-year-old woman with lupus at a cost of about $50 a month. When Obamacare arrived, it canceled Emily's policy. She went on the exchange to try to replace it according to Washington's wisdom, and this is what she wrote to me. I cannot keep, this is Emily, this is a real woman in Tennessee who's really hurt by the Obamacare law. We should be talking about her. She says, I cannot keep my current plan because it doesn't meet the standards of coverage. This alone is a travesty. R-Tenn has been a lifeline for me. With the discontinuation of R-Tenn, I'm being forced to purchase a plan through the exchange. My insurance premiums alone will increase a staggering 410%. My out-of-pocket expenses will increase by more than $6,000 a year. That includes subsidies. Please help me understand how this is affordable. Here is an American woman who's been hurt by Obamacare. In fact, she lost her policy, a policy that she could afford. It fit her health care needs, it fit her budget, because all the wise people in Washington said, this is the policy that you need. So she got the policy that Obamacare says she should have, and her insurance premiums went up to $350 or $400 a month, and she got an insurance policy that does not fit her budget and does not fit her health care needs. She's the one who's been hurt, and unfortunately, Emily is not the only one experiencing rate shock. Millions of Americans are losing their insurance plans. They're being forced to buy new plans, many of them with higher premiums, many of them with higher deductibles, many of them with co-insurance. Let me tell you about another Tennessee woman whose name is Carol, a single mom with a son starting at Austin Peay University in the fall. She's an office administrator in an office that used to have R-Tenn insurance that cost less than $100 a month in premiums and covered all of her health care needs. Carol says, quote, now thanks to Obamacare, I must pay over $300 a month, compared with $100 a month, in insurance premiums for a policy that has a $2,500 deductible and a $4,000 out-of-pocket limit. If we want to talk about a war on women, let's talk about a war on Emily and Carol in Tennessee and millions of other women who are hurt by Obamacare. Carol earns too much to qualify for a subsidy, so now she puts a big chunk of her income toward her premiums, such a big chunk that she can't afford to help pay for her son's education. These are the kinds of stories all of us hear from people who are being harmed by Obamacare. These are the kinds of stories that our friends on the other side don't want repeated. So they even go so far as to bring up carving big chunks out of America's character by trampling on religious freedom, the freedom that's talked about in the First Amendment. We have proposals to help Americans like Carol, Americans like Emily. We have offered them on this Senate floor repeatedly since 2010, when the Obamacare law was passed. They would move our country in a different direction toward health care as rapidly and as responsibly as we could go, a direction toward more freedom, more choices, and lower costs for Emily and for Carol, for millions of women and millions of men and millions of younger people, men and women across this country. Our bills would allow Americans to keep more of their insurance plans, as the President's promised. Our bills would allow people to buy insurance in another state if it fits your budget and fits your needs. Let's say Emily, who has lupus, finds a policy regulated in Kentucky that fits her budget and fits her needs. We would allow Emily to buy that. We would allow small business employers to combine purchasing power with other employers and offer their employees lower cost insurance. More freedom, more choices, lower costs. We would allow Americans to buy a major medical plan to insure them against a catastrophe. Today, some Americans can, but under Obama, all Americans cannot. Buy a major medical plan to insure against catastrophe. That's what a lot of Americans would like to do. And then buy a health savings account that is expanded to pay for everyday expenses. More freedom, more choices, lower costs. We would like to repair the damage Obamacare has done. We would like to prevent future damage. Republicans want to move in a different direction that provides more freedom, more choices, lower costs. We trust Americans to make decisions for ourselves. That is the American way. That is what we believe in. Religious freedom and health care freedom. That is the American way. Mr. President, I thank the chair.